3 days after we moved into our first home together, the previous owner called me with a shaking voice and said he needed to tell me something he had forgotten to mention before handing over the keys. What he said next made me grip the phone so hard my knuckles went pale. My name is Nathan. And until that phone call, I genuinely believed the hardest part of our life together was already behind us. My wife Sarah and I had spent 4 years saving for that house. Every room tour felt like proof that the sacrifices had been worth it. She walked through every space, talking about where we would put the dining table, which bedroom would eventually become a nursery, what the garden would look like once we had time to properly tend it. The man we bought the house from was a widower in his late 70s who was relocating to be closer to his daughter. He seemed straightforward and kind at every meeting. We signed the papers on a Friday and moved in that weekend. The call came on Tuesday morning while I was at work. The previous owner explained that during the process of disconnecting his old security system, he had discovered one outdoor camera he had forgotten to deactivate. It had remained linked to his cloud storage account and had continued recording. He apologized 3 times before telling me what it had captured. Sarah had arrived home on Monday afternoon while I was still at the office. Several minutes after her car entered the driveway, a second vehicle pulled in. An older man stepped out, paused to look in both directions, and followed her into the garage. They remained inside for nearly 40 minutes before leaving separately. The previous owner said he had no reason to fabricate this. He felt responsible for warning me because the camera had been his oversight. He offered to share the footage immediately. I told him I needed time to think. I sat with what he had told me for the rest of that day without saying anything to Sarah. She had been beside me through every difficult year we had experienced together. She had never given me a reason to question her. But the detail that stayed with me, the one I could not find an explanation for, was that nobody except Sarah and I knew where we kept the garage key. Doubt is not the same as certainty, but once it enters a quiet house, it is very difficult to ask it to leave. I hired a private investigator 4 days later. I told myself I was doing it to protect the marriage from a false accusation, not to confirm one. What the investigator found over the following 2 weeks was not what I had expected. The older man was not meeting Sarah at restaurants or hotels. Every meeting occurred near our property. They exchanged sealed envelopes in locations with minimal foot traffic. He arrived in a different rental vehicle each time, which suggested the arrangements had been carefully considered rather than casual. He did not appear in any of Sarah's documented contacts as a relative, colleague, or professional associate. Nothing about the pattern looked innocent, but nothing about it looked like what I had initially feared either. It looked like something else entirely, something I did not yet have the vocabulary for. One evening, I left the office 2 hours earlier than usual without telling anyone. I entered the house through the back door and heard voices from the direction of the garage. Sarah's voice was tense and low. The older man was telling her they were running out of time and that a decision needed to be made before the end of the month. I pushed the garage door open. Both of them went completely silent. Sarah began crying before I had said a single word. The older man did not move. Then he spoke, slowly and clearly, and introduced himself as the biological father Sarah had spent most of her adult life trying to locate after he had left when she was 4 years old. My anger did not disappear, but it shifted. He explained that years earlier, facing significant debt, he had transferred valuable family property into a third party's name to shield it from creditors. Those assets had since appreciated substantially and were now worth several million. He had returned because he wanted to recover what remained legally recoverable before his other relatives, who had no knowledge of Sarah's existence, discovered the situation and moved to claim everything themselves. Sarah had hidden the meetings because she was afraid I would conclude she was motivated purely by the money. She thought silence would protect us. She believed secrecy would keep the marriage safe. What she did not understand was that silence and suspicion occupy the same space. What followed was the most difficult conversation we had ever had, not because of what she had done, but because of what keeping it hidden had cost us both during the weeks I had spent wondering. The situation grew considerably more complicated when Sarah's existence became known to her father's other relatives. People who had never acknowledged her arrived with attorneys and financial advisors and the practiced warmth of individuals who have recently discovered they have something to protect Cousins she had never met invited her to dinners. An uncle she had never heard of sent flowers. Every conversation eventually circled back to the assets and who had the strongest claim to them. A formal hearing was eventually scheduled. What the court proceedings revealed went well beyond the original property transfers. There were forged signatures on documents from 2 decades earlier. There were accounts that had been structured specifically to obscure ownership. There were lies that had been maintained across an entire generation and had only survived as long as they had because nobody with the right questions had been in the room to ask them. The relatives who had embraced Sarah so quickly when they believed she might be useful turned on each other the moment the judge began working through the documentation. The image they had collectively constructed collapsed in a room full of people they had been trying to impress. The assets were returned to their rightful legal position. Most of the people involved exited the proceedings with significantly less than they had arrived hoping to secure, and with reputations that would take considerably longer to rebuild than any financial loss. Sarah's father accepted the outcome without complaint. He said it was the consequence of decisions he had made a long time ago and that he had not expected anything different. Several months later, Sarah and I renovated the garage. We did not discuss the specific reason, but we both understood it. The space needed to become something other than what it had been. The previous owner visited once after the work was finished. He walked through the house quietly and said it looked like a home now. Before he left, he told me he had almost not made that phone call. He had worried it was not his place to say anything. I told him it was exactly his place. Without that phone call, the investigation would never have happened. Without the investigation, the court hearing would never have been triggered. Without the court hearing, Sarah's father's relatives would have quietly finalized their claim on assets that partially belonged to her and moved on before anyone noticed. The truth arrived because one elderly man decided that honesty was more important than avoiding a difficult conversation with someone he barely knew. That is not a small thing. We learned something from all of it that I do not think either of us could have learned any other way. Trust is not damaged only by betrayal. It is damaged by the fear of what honesty might cost. And it is rebuilt not by pretending that fear does not exist, but by choosing to speak anyway. The garage is a storage room now, quiet and ordinary and completely unremarkable, which is exactly what it should have been from the beginning. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button and follow the Kinbreak Diaries. New stories arrive every week, and the next one will stay with you long after it ends.